I'm Jarrett Fuller. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm joined today by the architect, engineer, and scholar Lydia Kallipoliti. Lydia is an assistant professor of architecture at Cooper Union in New York City and is the author of the book The Architecture of Closed Worlds. She's also currently the co-curator of the 2022 Tallinn Architecture Biennale. I've been following Lydia's work for a few years now with great interest. I am fascinated with how she uses speculative projects, alternative pedagogies, and non-traditional architecture to examine the field and the built world. But I've also been interested in how she thinks about publishing this research. She's curated shows, published books, led studio classes and workshops, and given talks. And so I was curious to hear how she thinks about scholarship and then how she thinks about getting that scholarship out into the world. So in this episode, we talk about that. We begin with her early education in architecture and engineering and how, despite this building-centric education, she moved away from being an architect who builds buildings. We talk about her idea of immersive scholarship and how she thinks about building audiences around that research. It's really nice to hear how she thinks about bringing her projects, her research, and her teaching together, looking for overlaps and points of connection. If you like this show, I hope you consider supporting it on Patreon. We offer 3 monthly tiers, $3 for students, $5 for patrons, and $10 for superfans that give you access to all sorts of bonus content like our monthly newsletter, early episodes, full transcripts, and exclusive bonus interviews, all while helping to financially support this show. So if you like Scratching the Surface, if you would like more of it in the world, I hope you consider joining us on Patreon. You can visit patreon.com/surfacepodcast for all the details and to help support the show. Thanks for listening, and here is my conversation with Lydia Kallipoliti. I want to begin this conversation kind of going back to your early education, actually, and use that to sort of look at the trajectory of your career, which is, in preparing for this and thinking about you, I've kind of pieced together a little bit. You originally studied architecture and engineering while you were in Greece, still in Greece, and then went to MIT for design and building technology. And then you then went on to Princeton, which we'll talk about in a second. But I want to talk about those first 2 degrees for a second. I'm interested in what your interest in architecture was and what that looked like. It's interesting to me that both of these degrees involved, engineering and building. Is that what you were interested in? Did you think you were going to design buildings that were then built in the world?
And then I ended up not building.
Well, that's my question. That's what I want to know about, how that happened.
How did that happen? Well, I kind of fortuitously ended up in architecture. It's not that I was building Lego since I was 3 and knew exactly what I was, and I had a perfect plan of everything. I was actually much more interested in basketball when I was younger than it was my favorite thing to do in the world. I was interested in reading quite a bit before I ended up in architecture. I read a lot of American literature. I was in a school that was in Greece, that was an American college. So before that, my mom was an architect and she suggested it, but I was never really, intending to do it as a career. And it just so happened that when I entered the school, I was fascinated with all the different possibilities of, I saw architecture as basketball, like moving bodies in space. But it was a very technical education in Greece. We had the architecture degree was also an engineering degree. So a large part of the education was doing a lot of courses on concrete and metallic structures and calculating structures and understanding the materiality and the way to realize a kind of vision. So that aspect, that context of my early education in Greece, in Thessaloniki, which is where I come from originally, was quite at the side of engineering related to math, a lot of math.
Hmm.
And I loved math. I was very interested in solving problems, and it was a kind of good framework. Which later on in my early teaching years, all of these skills were very rare in American academia.
Mm.
I had to be teaching integrated building studios, and I knew what the structural capabilities of different kinds of building proposals would be, which is not something that a lot of my colleagues were
Yeah.
familiar with. And it was a kind of fortuitous skill that I've inherited from my education in Greece. Because of that, I was interested in becoming part of building technology programs and learning more about new materials and methods, and I still have this interest from a theoretical perspective, but MIT seemed like the best place to go for getting that kind of education, and I ended up in the building technology program at MIT. And a lot of the professors in the building technology program were engineers.
Mm.
Some were mechanical engineers, others were structural engineers. One professor that I had, I remember, was an expert on submarines and indoor air quality in submarines. And one of the things that, and my colleagues were also engineers in the building technology lab. So a lot of the things that I ended up writing and investigating from a theoretical perspective were part of a cohort of a group that I was with, mechanical engineers, and they all investigated sick buildings and indoor air quality.
Mm.
And that became a big part of my interest. But at the same time, I met people from the history theory program at MIT and the history of science program. And I read Donna Haraway for the first time.
Hmm.
I read text on biopolitics and Foucault,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that kind of changed my worldview 180 degrees. And I found all of this kind of opening extraordinarily important and insightful. And it really opened up the world of technicality to another realm. And it was really amazing to see how these two worlds could collide. They still don't, but I was so enchanted with the possibility of I don't know, like combining the overlapping the solipsistic view of the theorist that is interested in the advancement of theory alone to the very, very technical aspect of the building technology that have their own methods and ways of operating,
Hmm.
which is
Hmm.
another kind of solipsism. And what these two worlds, the overlapping of these two kind of realms, would bring to the table. And a lot of my work in later on was I think emerging from that kind of overlap, building technology with environmental politics and theory.
Yeah, it's, I mean, as you were saying that, I was like, oh, so much of what you're doing was like right there at the beginning. I'm hearing it come together as you're answering that question. I'm interested in two things, though,
Yeah.
kind of quickly about that era. You mentioned that your mother was an architect, and that's not something that you had really considered growing up. And I'm kind of curious if you think her work shaped any of your kind of coloring of what it meant to be an architect or what an architect does in a way that you wouldn't have had if you didn't have that background.
Well, that's a really interesting and complicated question,
Yeah.
because it immerses oneself in the psychology of what they want to be and how much they want to be of what their parents are. And I guess I was one of these kids that did not really want to be what my parents were. But in many ways, I am an architect, right? I have a professional architecture degree and an engineering degree. But but to be fair to my mom and my growing up, like a lot of times, like I grew up in in an office where she would have me draw while she was drawing.
Mm.
And I would tell her things. Like, I remember telling her at one point, she asked me, like, do you like what I drew? And I said, no, because it doesn't look like a whale. It's like, why, why would it need to look like a whale? I'm like, because it's so much more interesting than what you're drawing. And I remember I drew a whale on top of her building. So I did have these moments like that, with where I was really acquainted with T squares
Hmm. Hmm.
and the grid and the way to identify buildings graphically. So it was not a foreign language that parachuted from Mars,
Right.
in my mind. But I can't say that it was something that I've always wanted to be doing. It so happened, I think, when I went to architecture school, I realized that, there's so many more possibilities to what an architect can do
Yeah.
instead of becoming, because my mom was mostly working with, developers in Greece to design buildings. And it was a very different kind of practice than anything I'm doing. But I do think that it has subconsciously influenced me in many ways.
I mean, and you're setting up exactly what my next question was too, which is why I sort of asked about that childhood experience, is because it seems very quickly that you moved away from a sort of very traditional understanding of what it means to be an architect. I mean, like, the first thing you said is that, you're not building things, and I'm curious about that sort of transition. I'm always interested in these sort of alternative practices, or these ways to call yourself an architect or a designer that are sort of outside of the kind of common definition. It sounds like that started to happen for you at maybe even before MIT a little bit, but as you were starting to read these texts, can you talk a little bit about that sort of, that kind of thinking about not being an architect but being an architect? You know what I mean?
Well, just to be, I did build things in the past, and I did go through phases of trying to be an architect proper, right? Like, or
Mm,
um, so I did go through several of these phases. But just to be fair, I don't think of myself as an architect right
mm,
now. I mean, I think I could build if if somebody would come and, like, oh, we need to build this, and I am designing installations and
hmm,
all of
hmm.
these things. And one of the things that I'm really good at, for some strange reason, is details. I'm really good at detailing and thinking of materials and all
Hmm.
of that. But at this point, I'm not the traditional architect that I don't know about code, and I'm not a
Yeah, yeah.
practicing architect, right? So it's more of a combined research practice where I do my work manifests in installations, publications,
Hmm.
experimental projects, books, thinking about different ways of disseminating scholarship and distributing scholarship. And sometimes I've called my work an immersive type of scholarship, like how to
Mm,
inhabit ideas about history, about theory, and make them visible to a wider audience. I haven't come up with a perfect title on it, but I have to, just to make a little parenthesis on, I did go through a phase during my PhD where I worked as an architect with my partner at that time, where we did renovations in New York, and we built them, and we did construction drawings, and
mm,
full sets of documents, and went to the city and got permits, and we kind of did that. And even before that, I was working for architects, and I was project architects for different kinds of projects in Greece before I went to MIT. So I do have in my background proper architectural training. But in New York, what happened was The clients that we used to have were wealthy clients
Mm.
that had a very specific way of operating in the world that was right at the crux of the financial crisis of
Yeah.
2008.
Yeah.
And there was lots of capital, and I started to slowly develop a resistance to how money was spent or how to educate people on what is, I wouldn't say the word right is proper or appropriate, but they were just making us ship wood from other countries because they liked that wood. The wood arrived and then they didn't like it and they dumped it in the alley. And
Yeah.
all of this embodied energy and all of this waste, and the way that people that were privileged were dealing with waste, and you facilitating that as an architect, it just seemed so unethical to me.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
profitable. It was profitable, and I sometimes like, "Well, why the hell did I stop doing it?" And like, I could make so much money, but it was just not what I wanted to do in my life. I wanted to serve others in some ways, or to either curate pieces of knowledge through exhibitions, or make statements, or kind of work that would somehow create discourse and
Hmm.
become useful for others. And in no way did my renovations were useful to anyone other than themselves or to the cause of um, let's say, them wanting to be an architectural digest. So ethically, that whole practice was problematic to me, to what I wanted to do in my life.
Yeah, Lydia, you're so great to talk to for a couple of reasons. One, you set up everything that I wanted to talk to you about in that answer. All of my questions are now set up there. Um, but we're also very similar, and I don't mean to kind of like project my story onto you, but I very much relate to that story that you were just telling. And I worked as a graphic designer in Silicon Valley, uh, and it felt the same way. That it was, how I was facilitating these, very large sums of money for these very rich people to design certain things, that were, quote unquote, to make the world a better place. But, being on the inside could see that wasn't doing it. And I felt the same way that you're talking about working with these clients. And that's why I went back to grad school, because I was interested in, disseminating knowledge and curating. All this stuff you're talking about is exactly my experience in graphic design also. So was it after that you then went to Princeton?
No, I was in Princeton at the time,
Okay. Okay.
and it was just the moment that I have finished my general examinations and my coursework. And usually, like the way the PhD works is that the students, like, they move out of Princeton after that, and they write their
Right.
PhD. Or in
Yeah.
touch with their advisor, and it was just a kind of connection with my partner at that time and his desires, and that kind of led me to that course in
Mm,
practice. And
mm.
it was interesting to me to also practice because I had the engineering knowledge. Like I did know all of these materials from MIT, and I was like, oh, that could be interesting. Um, but it was a journey, right? Like I quickly
Hmm.
realized that practice was not very creative,
Yeah.
but it was like 90% logistics and 10% creativity. And but it's not even that my model was this kind of lone creator, like per the model of Anne Rind in
Right.
the
Right.
Howard Rourke character. I don't know if you know this.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Everybody knows the Fountainhead, right?
Yeah.
But it wasn't that I had a vision and it had to be made. It was not that. It was the processes of labor, logistics, waste,
Hmm.
embodied energy, which were kind of culturally problematic. And it was a problem for society to dump all of this waste.
Hmm.
So I mean, I'll tell you an interesting story right now because this is a free flow conversation.
Yeah. Go for it.
So I met at that point. His name was Al Atara, and he was an older. He passed away right now, because he was an older, incredible person that had a building in Brooklyn, on 33 Flatbush Avenue.
Mm,
And he could have been a millionaire, but what he did was he had a truck, and he collected all of these materials from the street, right? Like chairs,
mhm, mhm,
curb alert. So he would go all over the city and collect all of these items. And because there were all of this waste of, old sinks and kitchen that were almost like landmark elements, like they could be antiques. Somebody recommended Al, and he came and picked all of that stuff up. And
okay.
I developed a friendship with him. We would take that stuff there. My MIT thesis ended up being about material recycling. It was called Regenesis of Diverse Matter, dross. So
Mm,
I was really interested in recycling and how we can re-envision processes of recycling. And he had this experimental community that he was building at MET. That's what it was called, Metropolitan Exchange. That was the name of the
mm,
space on 33 Flatbush. And he brought all of these different kinds of designers to have a desk and work on their practices and their models. So
mm,
I found this community of people, and a lot of other architects in New York that I know and I'm friends with still, come from that space, from that experimental space that Al Attara founded. Um, and I he was my, let's say, support platform. Like the things that would be wasted from Park Avenue, he would come and pick them up.
mm,
We would take them to Met, and other people would work on them. So my soothing was that it would create a kind of life cycle of materials in the city, that these rich people would throw them away in Park Avenue, but he would pick them up, and with me and these other people, and they would become part of this community of young designers that were trying to work on offset goals, not directed, not related
right.
to that moment. But then, that community had its own dynamic and energy, and I became part of them, and I started teaching in New York, and I just didn't want to do these renovations anymore.
Yeah, I know that feeling very well. It's such an interesting story too for two reasons. Um, I think that also I'm hearing the sort of seeds of so much of your research since then being planted there, or origins there, or kind of germinating there. But I want to talk to you about teaching for a second, because you've been teaching for almost alongside of your practice, for most of your career. And uh, I'm sorry that I keep kind of banging on this idea of like the architect who's not building, but like I said, I'm fascinated. I love that idea. Um, maybe because I sort of feel like a designer who's not designing anymore. But I'm curious about your students. Are they, and I don't mean for you to generalize here, but
Mhm.
where are their interests? Are they interested in building and designing structures that will live in the world? And then with your research, whether that is closed worlds, which we can talk about in a bit, or you've done like research on life on Mars and things like this, that is a little bit outside of that. How do you kind of teach students about these alternative practices, that the idea of being an architect is much wider than we sometimes give it credit to be?
um i'm uh I'm very lucky because I'm part of a school that has incredible students.
Mm,
And I also have incredible colleagues at the Cooper Union. And I can't say that it's a school that's geared toward professionalization.
mm,
So a lot of my colleagues and the students are interested in this kind of experimental work.
okay.
Um, and they're not interested necessarily in scholarship, which is another facet of my activities on, writing a scholarly book. but they
Hmm.
are interested in the way to disseminate that scholarship. So let's say I'm doing a kind of I'm always focusing on themes and topics. So the project that I did for Mars, which was for a museum, it was a research project, it was a design project, but I also wrote a bunch of papers related to that. And it always, every project becomes its own world that generates different kinds of outputs.
Hmm.
How that migrates to teaching, I think it's very organic, because especially in the form of a studio, you really relay your own experiences in one way or form um, to and your own kind of knowledge pool to the students. And they are kind of sponges, they're absorbing that, but I'm also learning from them. And I can't say that I've encountered, at least at Cooper, students are like, oh, I want to go work for SOM and I want to know this detail,
Yeah.
and I need to learn that. I think that students are very curious and they want to know as much as they possibly can on different fields. So I think teaching is a very prime, it just, it I learned from it.
Yeah.
There hasn't been one day that I get home from teaching and I feel that I've been drained
Yeah. Yeah.
emotionally. Whereas when I get out of, bureaucratic meetings for curating this and that, and like I just feel drained emotionally. But it's a very rewarding work because it's a dialogue, and my teaching is not prescriptive. I see it as a kind of collaboration, a
Hmm.
deep collaboration. I'm interested very genuinely in what the students think and what they want, and try to have a kind of active, like almost platonic dialogue with each and every one of them. So it kind of, teaching and doing that kind of experimental work is much more organically intertwined than you would think. It's not that I have to transfer or create a special kind of framework or context
Hmm.
to make them interested in these kinds of activities. They want to be part of it. They want to be part of, the biennale that I'm curating,
Right.
um, or this or that. They're interested. Like I have a student doing her thesis on mushrooms. Like she's
Mm.
obsessed with mushrooms since for a year, and she's like bringing like different kits and growing mushrooms and photographing them. And these are the kinds of students I work with. And just to see somebody that's so committed to a project and engaged and interested in observing and learning,
Yeah.
curiosity is the deepest form of intelligence, I think.
I'm interested in that sort of the influence of each sides of these. So like the research and the scholarship and then being in the classroom when they talk to each other. And so are you working on projects typically that you then sort of turn into studio classes, or do things sort of bubble up in the studio that become bigger projects? How do you kind of how do you kind of think about that, and how do you start to kind of organize these different projects that you're working on around these themes?
Definitely that happens, the kind of clustering,
Hmm.
but not in a master plan.
Right.
So it's not that, let's say I would, I'll just give you an example. It's not that I would say, okay, I have a biennale and this section needs to be produced by students, go students work. No, that's
Mm.
not what happens.
Hmm.
It is more because I also see a kind of ethical commitment to teaching where you really have to allow them the space to develop their interests and to teach them teachable content, not to use them as tools to produce an installation. So
Hmm.
I've never done that. But what I have done is, for example, Closed Worlds was a seminar,
Right.
that in different formats, in different universities, which allowed me the luxury to read every week, different kinds of texts for the students to read, and like we had discussions on them. So it almost creates like an underlayer for which research could be built upon, but it's never the actual product
Right.
of the research. It's always, I always see teaching related to research. They're completely inseparable and intertwining. And I think that it's really healthy, if I'm interested in a subject, to create a seminar and to read more about it and have the students read more about it and have all of these discussions. That helps me tremendously to hear what they think. And
Mhm.
it also interests them, because if I'm researching on it, I know a lot about it and I can teach them um, about that subject. But it is never with the scope of the product. You see what I mean? So
Yeah.
like for the Tallinn Biennial, I've also done a course which was a seminar. I'm not really using any of the seminar products in the biennial, but it helped me to and the students, like, to ask important questions about the
Yep.
topic and to understand fundamental parameters of how curatorially I would organize work.
That makes perfect sense. That's exactly kind of what I was interested in. It's almost like you're using the classes, you're using the seminar almost as like a beta test, a way to kind of test out these ideas, see what happens, as opposed to using them, as generating a product or something. That's really interesting. I like that you brought up the Closed Worlds project. I think this is a good way to kind of talk about that because even just in this conversation, it's interesting how many sort of closed world metaphors you're using in describing your own work,
It's
and it
adapted.
yeah, and it kind of encompasses everything. And it's where I first came across your work was the architecture of closed worlds when it was an exhibition. Um, and so I have two questions kind of to start specifically about that project and that series of projects. For people who maybe are not familiar with it, can you kind of describe the architecture of closed worlds and what a closed world is?
It really was. I mean, I'm gonna first read, and this is the only time I'll do that. I promise. I don't like
Okay.
reading out loud, but I think that it does explain some things, right? Because um, one of the criticisms that I've received was that it's too expansive. Closed
Mm,
world has like a technical meaning in cybernetics, like in ecology discourses and so forth. And I included in the way that I was conceptualizing this topic, and I was approaching it in the book and the exhibition, everything, it ranged from submarines to
yeah.
space capsules to office buildings, malls,
Mhm.
apparatuses, countercultural domestic environments. And I started, when I was describing that, I was like, okay, so what do all of these things have in common? Each was conceived as a closed system, a self sustaining physical environment demarcated from its surroundings by a boundary that does not allow for the transfer of matter or energy. So the idea was to understand the production of environments as separated from the exterior world, the effluence of the seasons of, and the kind of conception of architecture as the production of a piece of nature on its own.
Mm,
And in that ambition, which is an ambition that is entirely intertwined with the history of utopia, um, you have many different ways in which all of these systems have manifest spatially, but you also have many kind of technical ideas like self-sufficiency, autonomy, energy autonomy, material recycling. So how to sustain an environment without being connected with a grid of supplies, like
mm,
off-grid systems. But I think that one of the things that I was trying to show is the extreme separation of inside, outside, and the understanding of architectural production through the kind of production of the reproduction of pieces of nature.
Mm,
And that to rewrite basically the history of architecture, design, and engineering in the 20th century, because in many ways and forms, if you look at the last maybe 30 or 40 years to the way that buildings are canonically detailed and produced, right? A lot of them don't have operable windows. They
hmm
have very little exchange. They're sealed. They create their own kind of atmospheric content inside sealed borders. And the issue of climatic control is incredibly important and generates its own kind of interior landscape, both culturally and technically. And it was a project to address that, right? The ambition was fairly big, right? How can one rewrite the history of 20th century architecture, design, and engineering, if you look at it not from a kind of formal perspective, but through the production of closure, of enclosure, and through the understanding that architecture or built environment is a reconstruction of the world in time and in space, that has its kind of total reconstructed environment, its own materials, and it, as I said, produces nature on its own. And as part of that, I was interested in a lot of different facets that are linked very strongly to what the cliche that we call sustainability, which is, ideas of autonomous living, ideas of recycling, synthetic naturalism, the production of new pieces of artificial natures, and the kind of transference of natural principles of metabolism and so forth from, natural system, from wilderness to architecture. So I can see that the premise is fairly expanded. But I think the selection of projects, like I did one of the limitations was that all the projects needed to be real. So they needed to be built, not just concepts. And I had building reports for all of the archive that I constructed. So to see how they worked, how they didn't work, and to get a sense of what were the issues in terms of the life cycle of these environments that were addressed and created. So and also the closure was really important. The idea of closure, of perimeter, something that is either looping within itself and its own ecosystems, or that is energetically self-sufficient, or is somehow kind of restrained from the, detached from the exterior world and operates as a kind of self-identified unit.
I think it's really easy to see that project and then the case studies as experimental, alternative, all of this stuff. But if you look at it, it's like you said, it is really speaking to, the history of architectural practice in building, and that all of these are real. And it goes back to the very beginning of this conversation of sort of you wanting to connect sort of, building and materials with the theory. I think is all sort of, embedded in that project. Um, I'm curious to go back to something you said earlier about your interest in disseminating knowledge and sort of different ways of publishing. And again, I think Architecture of Closed Worlds is a good case study here in that it was a seminar, it was an exhibition, it was a book. Can you talk about how you think about distribution of your research and how you think about how these things go out into the world and kind of what you want to do with each sort of medium or format?
Yeah. That's extremely important because I'm I think that diversity in the ways that one may distribute content is extraordinarily important. And one of the things that I'm entirely against is the kind of really small audience of scholarly work, and it's not. I mean, I do scholarly work. I am a scholar in the sense that I write with, all of the footnotes. I do archival research. I love it.
Hmm.
I love it. But what I don't love is, five people reading it
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
and having that impact in the world, because one of the things that I'm trying to do when I'm writing, and I love the way that scholarship is produced, is how to kind of relate these kind of questions that you find in an archive of this rare document to contemporary questions that all of us have today, that a younger generation has, or the people that don't necessarily know how to write in proper footnotes and citations and
Hmm.
captions and so forth. So doing all of these alternative platforms of disseminating material requires not just another medium. It's not like that. It's not just that you have to do drawings in addition to writing, but it's also you have to use a different kind of language, right?
Yeah,
And this is something that I'm very um, familiar with in writing text for the Biennale that I'm curating right now, where I'm having this conversation with the kind of press people, where they would say, "Oh, this is too dense and complicated for the audience," and I'm like, "Okay, I'll have to make it more clear." But what is the line between making it more clear and making
yeah,
it populistic or dumb?
yeah, yeah,
Of keeping the level of intelligence and criticality, but still addressing a wider audience. So that's a process of translation, right? How to speak to different kinds of audiences, but it's also they need to see different outputs. So for me, making images, making open source media platforms like websites is very very important. And a lot of people, when they see my visual work, let's say, they read some of the text that goes along with it. So I think it's extraordinarily important to have different kinds of output and to reach different kind of audiences. But again, not all academics are interested in that. This is just something that I'm interested in, and something that I find important, not because I want to have more people look at it, but because if I have a thought that I want to share that is important, then I know that if I use another medium, it will be more accessible to others.
yeah.
And before closed worlds, I mean, this is not something that you might find online, but I did this website called Eco Redux,
Mm,
which was online, and it won a number of awards. It's older, but it won like a Webby Award and
yeah,
some other, I don't remember the names, but like a bunch of digital platform awards. And it really was me getting like to archives, collecting all of these experiments that nobody knew about, writing about each of them, and curating them in a kind of platform for everybody to see. And
mm,
then I asked architects to look at these experiments from the 60s and redraw them. And I also found some of them and interviewed them like you do right now. And I linked with the audio. So it had a lot of material. The website is no longer there, but that was the first instance where multimedia scholarship became an important aspect of what I thought I would be doing.
yeah. It's so interesting. It's exactly why I'm kind of drawn to your work, also, because those are the questions that animate my work. Is thinking about taking these ideas and positioning them to different audiences, making them accessible to different audiences without dumbing it down, which I think is like a key point in what you said. I have two more sort of quick questions to wrap up. One of them builds on kind of what you were just talking about, and I want to connect it to the biennial that you're working on too, because I do want to talk about your current work. But how does thinking about these mediums, does that change your process at all? Does that change how you think about researching, how you think about writing, the output of this biennial that you're working on? How does the output then change the process, if it does at all?
Yeah, well, it's the same thing, the same kind of intention happened in the biennial as well, like the diversity of different kinds of outputs and mediums. And it was really important to me and my partner, Areti Markopoulou, with whom I'm co-curating the Tallinn Architecture Biennial. It was very important to us to not have only one kind of output,
Mm,
but to have an open call to attract a young audience and to have a kind of wide invitation of 100 people that we invited to do one drawing, and then we have our invited participation. But I think our intention was to approach the topic without exclusivity of the curator that asks five people to create this work, but to really engage entire communities to produce ideas. Now, how it changed the nature and the content of a topic, I think a lot.
mm,
Um, at the very the kind of work, and this is just starting to happen because we're just at the point where we're receiving certain submissions, but seeing what the participants bring to the table necessarily makes you question the nature of your own questions, and how you posited them
right.
at the very beginning. So it's a kind of cyclical process, right? Like a feedback process, for sure. But we're just at the very tipping point right now of starting to experiencing that in the biennial. But the intention is very much the diversification of all of these different kinds of outputs.
I think that's a good way to wrap up. So I'm going to ask you the last question that I use to end all of these. I'm curious what you're reading right now.
I have this book called Decolonizing Nature by TJ Demos, because a lot of my work stems from environmental politics,
Yeah.
environmental history, and because all of these questions of decolonization are so pressing in academia, I was very interesting to read a bunch of these books that address this topic. So this was one of them. TJ Damos. Another one was a book of Arturo Escobar,
Mm,
which was also about it was about the pluriverse.
yeah.
So these are two things, but I'm also reading, I'm seeing other things. I'm reading 19th century ecology and biology, and the kind of origins of ecological discourse,
Mm.
because I'm writing a book on the history of ecological design.
Oh,
And
wow.
yeah, that's gonna come out, I think, in November or December of 22.
Okay.
So it's kind of a encyclopedia. I would call it an unfinished encyclopedia, not
Mm,
not a real encyclopedia. There is no such thing in my mind as an encyclopedia that encompasses everything. But it's a book that I started writing this topic on the history of ecological design for Oxford English Encyclopedia, and it was really very well received and read by a lot of people. And I was proposed to write a book on expanding that topic on different on parallel histories of ecological design and unfinished encyclopedia. So I'm writing that book, which starts from the 19th century, and I'm trying to finish that chapter on acclimatization in the 19th century. So I have Biology in the 19th Century by William Coleman and The Background of Ecology by Robert McIntosh.
mm.
None of these are architecture books, by the
Right.
way, as you
Right.
can see. They're all kind of environmental history books. And I do read architecture books as well, but I'm inspired by these
Yeah.
kinds of other books?
All my favorite answers to that question. I ask everybody that question. The best answers are always the ones that are not architecture and design related, because they're usually the ones that I'm unfamiliar with. And so I always, get some new additions to my shelf. I thought this was such a great conversation. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much for being so kind. And it was really an enjoyable conversation. It didn't feel like work. I feel like
Good.
less arrows are pointed on my head right now.
This episode was recorded on February 11th, 2022. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can support the show on Patreon and find previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.